In chapter 4, we discuss privileges. We will first discuss marital privileges. Under marital privileges, we have two privileges. One is the privilege against adverse spousal testimony. The other one is the privilege protecting confidential spousal communications. It is. Let's first look at this privilege against adverse spousal testimony. It is important to understand this point, that is, the scope of the protection of this privilege is broader than the privilege protecting confidential spousal communications. Why the scope of protection of the privilege against adverse spousal testimony is broader? Because this privilege protects any adverse testimony. This privilege actually covers everything, covers all adverse spousal testimony. But when we come to the privilege protecting confidential spousal communications, as indicated by the name of the privilege, that privilege would protect only communications. So for that privilege to for one to invoke that privilege, there must be a form of communication. If there is no communication, then there cannot be protection under that privilege. But in this privilege against adverse spousal testimony, that this privilege would cover any adverse spousal testimony, regardless whether that is in the form of any communication or not. That's why this privilege has a broader scope of protection. It is also important for us to know, because the privilege against adverse spousal testimony has broader scope of protection. This privilege is controversial. Not all states recognize this privilege. Probably half of the states recognize it, and half of the states do not recognize this privilege. This is not the case with the privilege protecting confidential spousal communication. For the privilege protecting confidential spousal communication, all states recognize that privilege. So that is a important point for us to know. The rationale of the privilege protecting the rationale of the privilege against adverse spousal testimony. The rationale for this privilege is to protect and preserve a particular marriage, namely the marriage between the defendant and his wife. So, meaning is this: why we created this privilege against adverse spousal testimony, because we want to protect and preserve this particular marriage. If the husband is on trial for a crime, and then we would permit the wife to decline to testify, because we believe if we would compel the wife to testify against her husband, and that is not good for the family relationship. And suppose the defendant is on trial for a crime, and then his wife actually would show up in court to testify, and if the defendant is convicted and sentenced, and after maybe the defendant has served 5 years in prison, and he returns home, probably that is going to be very, very difficult for this marriage relationship. So that is really our concern. We believe to for the purpose of protecting this particular marriage, we should have this privilege against spousal testimony. So we would permit the wife not to testify against her husband. So that is really the rationale behind this privilege. Duration of the privilege. Duration of the privilege. We are talking about the privilege of privilege against adverse spousal testimony. So the duration of the duration of the privilege is as long as the marriage is in existence. This is very important. As long as the marriage is in existence. Meaning is, if this marriage is gone, if the husband and wife, they actually divorced, and then there would not be the protection for this privilege anymore, because we know the rationale for the privilege is to preserve this particular marriage. If the marriage is already gone, and then this privilege would not be in existence either. Let's look at two case scenarios. I think that should help us understand what we mean by this. Let's look at the first one. In this case scenario, when Alan and Nancy were boyfriend and girlfriend, Alan told Nancy that he broke into a department store and stole some iPhones. He also showed Nancy the stolen iPhones. Then they got married, and Alan now is on trial for crime. So this is during their marriage. So the prosecution intends to make Nancy testify about the crime. Apparently, Nancy actually knows something about this crime. And then the issue here is whether Nancy can invoke the privilege against adverse spousal testimony to decline to testify. The answer is Nancy can invoke the privilege against adverse spousal testimony to decline to testify. Even though Nancy learned her husband's crime before the marriage. We know this actually the crime was committed before their marriage, but because at trial, this marriage is in existence. At the time of trial, Alan and Nancy, their relationship is husband and wife relationship. So this privilege would apply. Nancy can invoke this privilege to decline to testify. So in this case, the court cannot compel Nancy to say anything. If Nancy said, I don't want to testify, and then she does not have to testify because this marriage is still in existence. But of course, we need to understand if suppose and if we change this case scenario a little bit, if we say during the marriage, while Adam and Nancy they were married, and then Adam went out, who committed this crime, and he stole some iPhones, and he showed Nancy the stolen iPhones, and then after that, and then two of them divorced. And then Adam is brought on trial. So we know this Adam committed the crime during the marriage, but at the time of a trial, Adam and Nancy, they are no longer married. And then what would happen now? If the prosecution would ask Nancy to testify, can Nancy still invoke the privilege against adverse spousal testimony to decline to testify? The answer is no, because now the marriage is no longer in existence. So Nancy can no longer invoke the privilege against adverse spousal testimony if Nancy knows anything about this crime, and then the court actually can compel Nancy to provide testimony. So that is the duration of protection of this privilege against adverse spousal testimony.